Hi everyone, Nadezhda here live from Belgrade. Hope everyone's doing well, hope everyone is doing the good work or has finished the good work. Today's lesson is going to be about the dimensions, and everybody knows a lot about dimensions. Essentially, these dimensions, they are these beginner's lesson, but this lesson is actually meant to be a little bit of the deep dive. It is meant to show you a little bit more about these dimensions and about some tips and tricks, about the way to handle them automatically, manually, how to set them up, how to draw them, how to modify them, and everything else about the dimensions. So we can wait a little bit, maybe a minute or two, so everybody joins, so there's more people. And in the meantime, you guys can post where you're from, where is the country that you are living, so I can see where my audience is. And then we can start with the lesson. Or maybe we can start with the lesson right now, and you guys post in the live reply about where you are from, so we can now begin. So when it comes to the dimensions, everything that you can find is in this annotate tool, and here you have the list of all the dimensions that you have in Revit. The main one that we usually use is the align dimension, and that is basically the one that you will use 90% of the time, because that is something that you use for the parallel walls. And you know the rules. Basically, you select one wall and you select the other wall, and then you click somewhere else, and as you can see, the dimension creates. But it's a little bit more nuanced than that, because there are also some kind of rules that we must follow. First one is essentially when we want to create the continuous dimension that goes in the stream, we go and we click each of the faces that we want, and if we are unable to click, for example, if we click here and we can't find this line between the walls, whenever we are not able to click something, we click on the tab key, and that way we can select this face that we wanted to select. If we want to break this dimension, if we want to divide it into several other dimensions, or if we want to delete the part of the dimension, we can click also on tab until we find that line that we want to remove, and then we can click delete. And as you can see, what that does is it separates this dimension into the several parts. And generally, we can also, generally, when it comes to creating these dimensions and when it comes to actually picking these faces, we do have the settings here in this prefer options, where we choose which of the default values we want to grab with this dimension. For example, before, when I was drawing this first dimension, you could have seen that essentially by default this wall face was being picked. But we can also choose the wall center lines, and in that case, as you can see, the snap that this dimension finds is actually the middle of the wall. And that doesn't mean that we can't pick face, but for now, when we set this up, when we want to pick face, we have to click the tab on our keyboard, and that way we will also be able to pick a face. And that is one of the settings, but you also have the center of the core, the faces of the core, and this is something that you can set up basically however you want, whatever works the best for you. I personally mostly choose the wall faces because that is something that we sort of have tendency to actually dimension the most of the time. This was also for the individual references, so for whenever we are actually adding this regular dimension, this is how it's going to be working. But we can also choose the entire wall, and that sort of gives us the ability to automate this a little bit. So when I click this and I click the wall, as you can see, the entire wall is actually dimensioned, and we can see also that it is dimensioned from the middles of the wall because we have left the wall center line here. But if we choose the wall faces and we select this wall, we also get the ability to dimension it directly from one face to another. And we can also go to the options tab, and here we also can add a couple of other options for the dimensioning. And I usually like to add the openings, and I like the opening widths more because centers actually just dimension the center line of the windows and doors. And we can also select the intersecting walls and intersecting grids. So when I click on the widths, I can see that now automatically I get the window dimensioned. I have to note though that this actually works for windows, doors, and for openings, but it doesn't work for the curtain panels, curtain walls, because as you can see, this curtain wall is not dimensioned. So if I wanted to dimension it, I would have to click the edit witness line, and I would have to include it in the selection manually, which is something that actually does break automatization a little bit. But anyway, mostly it is another addition to the work. And that is how we place these aligned dimensions. And we can also, when we want to add some value to that dimension, we can click on the edit witness line, and we can basically add the additional dimensions that we want. And basically, as I said before, align dimension is going to be used most of the time because align dimensions is the easier one, essentially. We also have the linear one, but the difference is when we have some walls that are not parallel. For example, let's just add one wall here, something like this. And we want to use the aligned option. Let me just turn off the pick entire walls. Let's just go back to individual references. And essentially, when it comes to align dimension, we cannot use it fully on the faces that are not parallel to each other. We can only use it on the parallel planes, and that is why the linear one exists. But essentially, I think it's still easier to kind of work with the aligned one, because once we select the point, because here we can actually, once we zoom in here, we can see that Revit can find this point and we can actually dimension it. We just have to be able to find this point of intersection, and then that way we can add the aligned dimensions. But you can also use the linear one and just add it this way, and it's kind of the similar result, but I find the aligned one to be much easier. Another thing that is, before we actually go ahead with creation of our own dimension, another thing that is important is that dimensions can also be used in Revit to move elements. Once we create one dimension, for example, something like this, and we want to change this dimension, what we can do is we can click and select this wall, and we can change its distance. For example, write something else, and that way we can actually also use these dimensions for the precise modeling. We can also use the equality of the dimension, because if we have, for example, some items that are going to be, for example, let's just add some imaginary couple of walls here. I'm just going to delete this tag so it's not in the way. And if we want to actually make sure that these walls are on the equal distances, what we can do is we can add these aligned dimensions again. And then once we create these dimensions, we can click on the equal option. And as you can see, this kind of gets them all to be equally distanced from each other. It is very handy to draft it this way. You don't have to kind of like measure and then draft on some distances. You can just use the equal tool and it helps you draft this much easier. But it is important to not forget to remove this equal, because this constraint basically, because if this constraint stays in the project and you move something like this, let's just move this wall for example, we can see that what we get is actually we get this error, and it also has the tendency to move many other elements. As you can see, it moved my entire facade, it moves this wall. Essentially, if you leave this equal dimension in your project without deleting it, it is going to be able to kind of move elements without your knowledge, and you're definitely going to accidentally make some mistake, make some mess in the model, so don't forget to delete it. There are many ways of deleting the equal quote. The first is if you click on this equal sign, it is going to just return this to being the regular dimension. You can also go to the, you can also select it and click delete, and you should here click the unconstrain, because if you click OK, without clicking unconstrain, the dimension is going to be visually deleted, but it's going to stay here. So it's going to kind of cause even more mess, because now it's going to be invisible. But if that does happen, if you do accidentally delete it and it remains as the invisible constraint in your project, what you can do is you can select one of these elements and then select this blue constraint and then click delete, and that way it's not going to exist anymore. Another way is by going to this reveal constraint option, and once you click on the reveal constraint, you can see exactly in this red color what constraints are left in your project. So you can click on the constraint and you can delete it, and now these walls will no longer move each other once they are selected. It is very important to note that, because a lot of mess happens by leaving constraint in the project. Generally, when it comes to constraining elements, constraining dimensions in the project, I kind of never do that. I actually always tell to my students to not constrain any of the elements, because it does seem good in theory, but it's a very, very dangerous tool, because it does have the tendency of moving elements on its own without your knowledge, and you do want to avoid it. I think constraining generally should be reserved only for the family editor, because families, they have the different systems. They kind of gives you the ability to sort of choose in which direction elements move, in how they move, and what do they pull with themselves. And in this project space, you basically don't have that much freedom like you do in the families, and all of these dimensions are going to kind of make a mess and move some other elements. They also do have the ability to corrupt the entire file, so it can cause much more damage than it actually seems. Like, it seems very, very nice, very helpful, but it's really not, because it's very dangerous tool. By those constraints, I mean all of these constraints, because you do have the ability, just like in the family, for example, to constrain some elements. Let's just hide this for a second. And you have the ability to, for example, dimension something and just lock it. And basically that is going to be, it does seem like a helpful thing, but it's really not. It's really going to make more problems. And the same goes for adding the global parameters to your model. A lot of people will, for example, add some global parameters to the ceilings, to the doors, etc. So they think they are basically unifying the dimensions. They are making the system for the later on updating of the projects, etc. But it's really not good tools, because they do cause a lot of damage. By global parameters, I mean once you, for example, want to unify this, let's say, space between the doors and the walls, or you want to unify the offset of the column ceilings, etc., you have the ability to add the parameter, the global parameter, by clicking the create parameter and then, you know, create that offset. But the real situation, the reality of this is that once you do that, you are not going to actually have that seamless movement once you change that global parameter, but you're actually going to get these elements to sort of move in the ways you don't expect them to. So I do not recommend any sort of constraining in the project, and that is something that I usually don't do, and I don't allow on the project. So that is something very important to mention. Next, when it comes to adding the dimension, and let's just add some aligned dimension, we have this default dimension, and this one isn't the default one, it was changed. But if you want to create your own dimension style, what you do is you simply go to the edit type and you duplicate the dimension. I'm just going to call it, for example, 3 millimeters Arial narrow blue. It is good to make sure that once you are naming these dimensions, you give them a name that makes a lot of sense. Like when you have a lot of dimensions in the project, you do want to be able to know what this dimension looks like the moment you see it in the drop-down menu. So once I click on OK, I can choose a couple of options. First option is the dimension string type, and 99% of the time this will be continuous. That means as we are creating these dimensions, we are adding the values, and these values are continuing basically, and they are just regular dimension. But if you want to if you change it to the baseline, what happens is each of this value, as you can see, I'm just going to delete these other dimensions so this is more visible. As you can see, each of these dimensions becomes this this order of several more dimensions. So this can be helpful in a very specific situation, but usually not on the regular project. And the same goes for the ordinate. When we create the ordinate dimension, I'm just going to create the new one, we get this sort of like adding up to the dimensions, not like this full value that gets added to the full dimensions. I'm not really sure how to explain this, but to be honest, I have never used this so far. I don't really know when are the times that it can be used. Essentially, as you can see, the measure from to this wall is 650. And then once we added this wall of 20, it became 670. So it just keeps adding and adding the value until it reaches the end. And by here it reached this number. So it is very specific dimension styles. I'm just using the continuous all the time. So that is some setting that you're mostly not ever going to change. And when it comes to the leader type, essentially when it comes to leader in general, we can just move this value, and if we have the leaders enabled, it is going to be following this value, it's going to be following this number, and it's going to be adding this leader, and you can choose what leader style you want. Do you want arc or something else? Also, it goes for the tick mark when we have the leaders. If we want to have the tick mark that kind of symbolizes where the text is supposed to be, it's going to be some of these tick marks that you decide here. This is also one setting that is connected to the leader, and generally this tick mark is also very important because by default, I think once you start the file, it's going to be very, very thick. And it is usually, I think, 4 or 5. So when we have these tick marks, they are very thick. So you do want to actually change the line weight here to make more sense, to be, for example, 1. And I'm also going to change this to be 1. I mean, this line weight is the line weight of the entire dimension, and this one is the line weight of tick marks. So what I mean is when this is set to default, we get this very thick tick mark. So you do want to change that right away, because by the default file it's very thick, and usually it's not supposed to be so overpowering on your plan, so you do want to change that. The dimension line extension is actually the line extension that we see here. Let's just change it to be 5, for example, and as you can see, it extends very, very long. So here you can choose how long you want this extension to be, and you can change its default value. I don't like it when it's too long, so I'm going to change it back to 2. The next option is the witness line control, and this one is also actually very important because what it does, for example, once we dimension couple of elements, you can see that even though I have offsetted this dimension to be very, very, very offsetted from these columns, it has been fixed. If you change this, if you actually leave it as to gap to elements, you can see that it's actually going to be following this element, and it's going to be adding the line, increasing the line as it moves from the element. So this can look a little bit messy on the drawing, so I usually change it to be fixed to dimension line. And the witness line length is also the length of this line, and once we change it, for example, to be 6, as you can see, it becomes much longer. And by the way, this line length can also be changed manually by each line separately. You have these 2 points, and the one point that is the outer point, it can be just grabbed by this point, and it can be moved however much we want it to move. While this other line, it actually is connected to the value of the dimension. That means the reference of what we are grabbing with dimension changes. So I just take this middle point and I change it to this other face of my column, and as you can see, it changed. So you can change each of the dimensions manually. And this is also very important because if you want to change what these dimensions, essentially you are going to be using this middle point. While this point, it only basically controls this line length. Once I go back to the edit type, we have a couple of more options. Let's just get this back to 3. We can also add the tick mark to the witness line, and we can also add the centerline symbol. And centerline symbol is used when we want to show the center line of some elements. For example, I can just add here this generic center line. We can also create our own families, and once I click OK, when I go and dimension something, let's just dimension this wall, and let's find the middle of it. As you can see, I am adding this center line symbol to each middle. It is also going to be applicable to the door, for example. So if you need ever to show center lines, which is maybe sometimes in the interior projects, that's where we sometimes show the center lines, this is the way you turn it on directly in the dimensions. I'm just going to turn it off because here I don't need it, and you can also have the center line different line pattern if that's what you need, and you can also have the tick mark. And if you want to have some different color, let's say for example we want this dimension to be blue, you can change it easily here. And as you can see now we get these blue dimensions. Other options are of course text, and text is, as you know, probably the most important and the most direct, the most obvious here, because here we can choose the underline, italic, bold. We can change the text size. For example, I was actually going to change this other dimension style, but I ended up changing this one. It doesn't matter, I can just rename this one to be 2.5 Arial narrow blue. And now we can change the text size. If we want to make this font to be bold, italic or underline, I think the better option is duplicating and creating the new dimension style where you rename it, and in the name you make sure to write bold or italic or whatever you are using, just so you are basically then using that option, that text, that dimension style only for the bold text. You also can change the text offset. That means, for example, if I want this text to be a little bit closer to my line, I can, for example, change it to 0.1. And this changes, and also entire font has changed to be a little bit bigger once we moved it, once we changed it actually. This option is also very important to you because you have the option of having opaque and transparent text. Once the text is opaque, you can actually see that there is this white fill, which is most of the times annoying if you have like the clean floor plans, but occasionally when you have like a lot of stuff going on, you do want to actually add this fill behind the dimension so your dimension can be read, can be seen actually. So it can be very useful, mostly in the site plans, because site plans have a lot of things going on the drawing, so you can update that. But in the majority of the other time, you can just turn it back to transparent. And you can also show the opening height and suppress spaces. Another thing that is important is units. So generally you have a couple of options. First is actually changing the units here. You can either choose the project settings, and then whatever is set up to be your main length unit is going to be the unit of your dimension. But if you uncheck this, you can change the units to be different units. For example, here, even though the model is in millimeters, I mean the main unit of the model is millimeters, but I have actually set this up to be in the centimeters. You also have the rounding. You can round to the nearest 100, 1000, to the nearest 10, etc. You can choose the rounding here. I usually go to 2 decimal places at least, unless I am actually doing the millimeters. And you can also choose the custom where you can round it, for example, like in this case to the next 0.5. So that means if this value, this 580, if it is 80.3, it's then going to round it to 80.5. So that is something that is very useful in the project, and you can also choose whether you want to show the symbol or you don't want to show this symbol. In this case, it is not visible. I'm just going to turn these centimeters, and suppress trailing zeros is actually also very important, because if I, for example, add the rounding to be two decimal places and I have the suppressed trailing zeros on, as you can see, this is going to be the round value. But if I go back to this option and I turn off the suppress trailing zero, as you can see, it's always going to add 0.00 to the end of my number, and usually we don't want that. We do want to suppress these trailing zeros most of the time, so that is something to keep in mind of. And another option that is very important is the alternative units, and if you are on projects where you have to show these values in two different units, you can do that as well. And you can choose the alternate units. First you can choose where they are, and then you can choose what these units are. For example, I can choose here to below, and then once I click here, I can choose the alternate units, for example, to be inches, and I say the symbol is, for example, inches, and I click OK. And as you can see, this basically converts this value to show it in the different units. And you can also choose the option off right, that this alternative units can be by this number. This now looks a little bit weird when it doesn't have space, because as you can see, kinda Revit lumps them together without adding space between these numbers. So you can actually change that by going to the alternative units, and you can, for example, add the prefix of this symbol. Not sure how it's called on English, to be honest, but you can add these different symbols, and then that way you kind of create separation between those two numbers. And you can also change how you want this equal text to show, whether you want it to have some different text, some different symbol. I'm just going to turn off these alternate units and click OK. Another thing about the overriding of these units is once you want to, for example, add some text, you can either use the actual value or replace this with some text, or you can keep this value and add some above text, below text, etc. For example, when I want to add the below text, I can just click, for example, width, and as you can see, it is going to be added below. And this we access by simply clicking once on this number. You can also replace it with the text. I'm just going to remove this below text, and you can just add text instead of your dimension value, and that is going to be working really well. But what you are going to be struggling with is actually adding the number instead of the text. If I want to, for example, if I have made a mistake here and I want to hide it, which is not something you should ever do, by the way, because it does have this tendency, we do have this tendency of forgetting whatever we fake here in the drawing. So if I try to do that, as you can see, I'm not going to be able to do that because Revit does not allow for overriding the number with the number, but there is a way of faking that as well. By right-clicking here, you can change this insert Unicode control character. And I would usually choose this nominal European digit shapes. And once you choose that and click OK, you can easily change the number. But like I said, this is not something that you should do, because this kind of doesn't have very good way of showing, because now I've moved this column. As you can see, I keep moving the column, but this value stays the same. So it's never good to actually override any dimensions with the number, because as I said, you're definitely going to forget about that, and once something changes, once something moved, this value is going to remain as the wrong value. So it's not a good thing to do. But unfortunately, sometimes we are all really pressed with deadlines, so we do have to make something happen in a minute. So, there is a way if you are in the real need of it. I'm just going to delete it. And that is basically how you override it. And that is also how you use those standard aligned and linear dimensions. You also have the option of the angular dimension, and this dimension, it only just measures the angle between few elements. You can just click one face and then other face, and then you can see how it looks like, how to change this, how to measure this value. And it works pretty much the same as everything else. Basically, these options are pretty much the same. You can change the units, you can add the alternate units, you can change the way your text looks. And right now I want to actually show you how to change these tick marks, or generally their symbol, because as you can see here, we have this short tick mark, and this tick mark is the diagonal 1 millimeter. And we also have many others. As you can see, you can choose any of these that exist here. And if you want to create your own one, if you want to create the new tick mark, you can go to the option of the additional settings, and you can choose these arrowheads. And I click on this arrowhead. And now I can choose, for example, this diagonal 1 millimeters. I will choose the most similar to the one I need. So I duplicated that one, and I am going to choose the 2 millimeters. I just insert the value and I click OK. And now we choose which of the arrow type we want. I'm going to leave it as diagonal, and I'm going to change the value to be 2 millimeters. And once I click OK, and I go back to the family, and I'm just going to find the tick mark option and change it to be diagonal 2 millimeters and click OK. As you can see, this increases. You can add that to any other dimension style as well. For example, here instead of arrow field 15 degree, we can choose this one that we just created. And you can do that, by the way, for every tick mark that you have in Revit. Basically, you can update them to have any other sort of look, any other sort of dimension, whatever you need for this to work. The next option we have is the radial and diameter. They are pretty much they work the same. Once you have the circular element, you can either add the radius or you can either add the diameter. Basically, you can update this, the way this looks, the way this dimension looks, the same way we have updated this regular one. It has the same option. And the final one is the arc length, and that is the one that I think most people struggle with. I'm just going to create a couple of walls so we can demonstrate how that works. I'm just going to create these two walls and one arc between them. And I want to actually dimension this, and I go to the arc length option. I'm going to choose either face, one of these faces, or either center line. And first I dimension arc, then I dimension one line, and then I dimension this other line. Basically, I find the either center line of it, or I find the faces of it, and then I just add this dimension wherever I want it to be. So this is how it looks like. Basically, you just have to remember that you don't just click the arc, but you actually have to click the other references that are by the arc, that are defining the reference of arc, basically. Another thing that is kind of interesting is that even when we have the whatever unit we have in the project, whether it is inches or centimeters or millimeters, it doesn't really matter. You can also once you want to move some element and you want to actually move this element by some value, you can actually insert that value in whichever unit you want. For example, if I want this room width to be, let's say, 4 meters, I can also click 4 meters, just 4 and the M, and this is going to become the 400 centimeters. So it's very handy sometimes when you are working in the units that are not like a default units for you, that are different units. You can actually use this to move it by the different units, and Revit responds to this as if you were drawing in these different units. It's a very, very helpful thing, especially if you are switching between units. And the next thing that we have is the spot elevations, and spot elevations are one of the most important units, because essentially in most of the projects we are supposed to add them, both the project spot elevations and also the absolute spot elevations. And for that to work out, we actually need to have the project that is georeferenced. That means essentially that we have set up those units, we have set up the heights, and in the edit type we can just to see if our model is correct, we can change the elevation base of this project to survey point, and then we can see this actual value of the absolute height of this project. If we want to change this, we can just go to the manage, to the coordinates, and options specify coordinates and point, and in the ground floor we can select it and we can insert the absolute height of our project. Even if the project is not georeferenced, we can still change the height just so we can use those spot elevations. And once we make sure that all of our heights are correct, when we set all of that up, we can go to annotate and we can go to spot elevation. I'm going to use this target project one and go to edit type. Here I first set up which of the spot elevation types I want. You can even create your own family if you don't like these generic ones, but I usually use this target field. I like that one for the plans, and for sections I have created my own one. Because for some reason in the new project you don't get the spot elevation section symbol, but it's very easy to create. So I go to the spot elevation target field, I just set up all of these stuff the same way I have set it up for the other dimension. And with with the spot elevation, the elevation base is your most important setting. First, we have the project base point, and that means essentially once we choose project base point here, I'm just going to call it target project as it was by default. That means that these heights are going to be the heights of the actual project from the project 0. So on the ground floor, I have 0, 0. And once I go to the L1 plan and I add one spot elevation, I'm going to have the height of 3.6 meters, which is the actual height of that level. But if I want to change it to the relative, and relative in Revit means basically relative to that level. These relative ones are used, for example, for the ceilings, because when it comes to the ceiling height, you do want to set up height from the level to see the actual clear height from the floor finish to the ceilings. And for the floor plans, we are always going to be using this project base point one, because that one is showing the height that is the height of this level from the ground floor perspective. How do I explain that? From the height of the project 0. And I'm also going to remove this text background, because that's something in this case with these color schemes and everything, it seems really weird to have this background. And I'm also going to change the offset, because I can see that it doesn't look the best when it comes to the position of the number from the symbol itself. So I am first going to change that, and I'm also going to change it to read meters, because it's much better when these spot elevations read meters, because it's kind of more readable. And I'm also going to move the offset, and we have this text offset from the leader, and we also have the text offset from the symbol. And text offset from the leader I'm going to choose to be 0.6, and this is I'm going to change to be, for example, 5. And as you can see, it's a little bit better, but I'm going to change it a little bit more. This can stay 0.6. And this can be, for example, 3. And I am actually going to move it in the other direction. I actually want it to be 7. And as you can see, once I change that, it kind of moves a little bit away from the symbol. And this text offset from the leader, it is actually moving from this line. So you do want to set that up, because you don't want to have any manual movement from the symbols, because you are going to have a lot of spot elevations and you don't want to go around and move them manually. You want to set these main settings up so you don't have any redundant work later on. Of course, if you do need to move it, you can change just by taking it for this point, finding this blue point, and just moving it wherever you want it to be. But like I said, I try to never move it manually, because I think this sort of stuff is best set up in the edit type of the family itself. Then after that, we can add the spot elevation of the absolute height. And I'm actually going to choose this no symbol absolute. If it doesn't exist, you can just take this no symbol project and then go to edit type and then create the new symbol absolute. I'm just going to leave this 2 here because we already have it in this project. And all you have to do is to change this to be survey point, because once you change it to be survey point, it is going to be reading the absolute height of the building, and that is going to be the survey height. And you can just also change it to be meters, because this is not good when it's millimeters because it's too many numbers. I also leave it to 2 decimal spaces, and I click OK, and then I'm going to add it manually. I also make sure to not have this white fill behind it. I just go to the text background and change it to the transparent, and I click OK. And this is how it looks. Unfortunately, for some reason, we still are not able to add these numbers in the actual as one single item, which is kind of annoying, but at some point I hope we get that ability. The only way we can add it for now as a single item is if we use the floor tag, and floor tag actually allows us to add both of these values, but it kind of is not a good way because you don't want to have the elevations as the floor tags. These are 2 different elements, and you do want to control them as their own element in the visibility graphics, etc. And another option we have is the spot slope, and spot slope is basically creating the slope arrow. You can just find one slope face and add the spot slope. You can change also the units, and you can also change the leader line length. For example, if I choose the 15, this is how it looks like. Basically, these are the main settings that we have. And this is also everything about today's lesson. Thank you for watching, thank you for being here, and I hope you liked the lesson.